evening, ladies and gentlemen. The date is March 18, 2019. The time is now 7 p.m. I call to order a meeting of the Havre de Grace Mayor and City Council. Mr. Seipel, may you please call the roll.
Councilmember Martin.
Here.
Councilmember Ringsocker.
Here.
Councilmember Robertson.
Here.
Councilmember Tamarkio.
Here.
Councilmember Zinner.
Here.
Council President Glenn.
Okay. Council President Glenn is absent this evening. He's had a surgery this morning, and everything so far from what we heard has come out very, very positive. So we wish Council President Glenn speedy recovery. Council meeting minutes of March 4, 2019 carry 4-0 in the affirmative. Thank you very much, Council. We're going to move on to item number 6, comments from citizens on agenda items. We have a handful of items on the agenda this evening. So I will start off with Mr. Warren Hartenstein. I'd like to call forward Mr. Bruce Russell, President of the Havre de Grace Maritime Museum. Good evening, sir.
Good evening. I'm President of the Havre de Grace Maritime Museum, Bruce Russell. I was asked to speak on behalf of the resolution proposal that the Havre de Grace Green Team is suggesting, and they'll speak later in agenda item 8D. The Maritime Museum has an environmental center, and we've been working hard the last few years to do some things good for the Chesapeake Bay. Our interest is in the Bay. We're in the process of actually developing an alliance with other like-minded organizations in the northern part of the Bay, and we should announce that once we get our 501c3 status. With respect to the resolution, I'm going to give you a little bit background about myself. I'm a retired Coast Guard senior officer. I was in the Marine Safety Environmental Protection Office with the Coast Guard. I had a lot of field experience. I managed 3 major oil spills. When the Exxon Valdez spill happened, I happened to be in Washington, D.C. assigned there, and I had some raising concerns following those oil spills. I also had expertise in risk assessment, risk management, risk-benefit analysis, specifically focused on oil hazardous material and nuclear issues. I was tasked by the Commandant of the Coast Guard to chair one of 2 committees looking at legislation that the Coast Guard could advocate within the Department of Transportation on addressing a lot of the issues related to the Exxon Valdez oil spill. The committee that I chaired, plus the other committee, we developed 5 white papers that dealt with prevention, response, preparedness, response itself, enforcement, and liability. That legislation, those white papers were the basis of legislation that finally did pass. Once I finished those papers, I was then received an accelerated congressional fellowship to work with the Senate committees that were working on that legislation, and I was their technical advisor. We did really well. That legislation passed. But what I wanted to say was we knew, and when I talked to the legislators and the industry and others, no matter what we did, the complexity of oil on water and how it gets there, how it moves, how it's explored, how it's transported, it's got so many variables in it that something bad will happen on a disastrous level no matter how hard we try as regulators and the industry. The BP Horizon oil spill that happened in the Gulf 5 years ago, to those of us in the industry, after I retired from the Coast Guard, I did work with the industry. It wasn't a surprise. And the calamity on that one, because I read the investigative report, it was human error, a lot of human error, and a lot of equipment error, equipment maintenance error, a lot of safety issues. People died, and that spill affected the large part of the Gulf. The interesting statistic about the Exxon Valdez oil spill, it impacted 1,300 miles of coastline in Alaska, including a lot of estuaries. 1,300 miles of coastline. That's the entire east coast of the United States. And so offshore drilling, and in and of itself can be an issue, but the transportation, the movement of it, et cetera, is no matter how hard you try, from a risk management perspective, something's going to happen. You just don't know when, where, why, how, or who. And the economic impacts, that's what risk-benefit analysis is about. It's not just cost-benefit analysis, which the risk-benefit analysis is a risk to the environment. It's also a risk to the economy. The risk to the economy of a big oil spill off the coast of Maryland or anywhere along the coast, because the oil will show up there, can be economically devastating. And that oil will get up into the bay. So I wholeheartedly support this resolution. Governor Hogan is opposed to the offshore oil development, and I think that we should join our sister cities, sister organizations within Maryland and say we can't countenance this. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Russell. Thank you. I'd like to call forward Mr. Nick Galero. Good evening and welcome, sir. May we please have your name and address for the record?
Nick Galero, 350 Bourbon Street, Havre de Grace. I'm glad I followed Bruce. It says something similar, but from a different perspective. As an individual, 11 days out of high school, I found myself in the U.S. Navy. My rate was sonar. And I did what Mr. Kirk Smith did below the surface, I did on top. Listened to sonar transmissions and passively listened to the sounds of the ocean. It's a symphony out there. There's so much going on. And when we were in active modes, I would hear what sound emissions did to whales. You would hear a thud against flesh, where when you hit a submarine, it's a sharp ping, or a seamount has a different sound. I knew it was happening to them. I have a feeling, though I haven't read the studies, I think whales beach themselves because their nervous systems are shot from the sound, which is so intense that when we did source sonar tests in the water, they said, don't get in the water. It'll just kill your eardrums. It'll shred you. It's that strong. And these are big, long, low-frequency waves that travel for miles. So I would like to say something about that aspect too. The biologics suffer greatly from this, and it'd be nice to oppose this resolution. Thank you. We got this, Mr. Glenn.
Thank you very much, Nick. Appreciate it. Thank you. I'd like to call forward Ms. Alison Kinney. Good evening and welcome. May we please have your name and address?
Hi, good evening. My name is Alison Kinney, and my address is 8 Woodrow Lane in Port Deposit, so just across the river. So I'm here this evening to urge the Havre de Grace mayor and city council as representatives of a city that is directly reliant on the health of the Chesapeake Bay and watershed, and as representatives of a city that I live across from and visit often, to pass a resolution opposing both offshore drilling and its predecessor, seismic blasting, which as I understand is on the agenda for tonight, and there will be some expert testimony later during the evening. Currently, on the federal level, a 5-year plan is being finalized to open up over 1 billion acres of the eastern seaboard to offshore drilling, a move that would put our economy, our environment, and our health in danger, with the risks expected to significantly outweigh any potential benefits, economic or otherwise. In 2015, according to a report issued by the Hogan administration, tourism contributed $2.6 billion to state and local tax revenues and generated 140,000 jobs within Maryland, and the seafood industry contributes hundreds of millions of dollars to the Maryland economy annually. But with offshore drilling, as was demonstrated by the Deepwater Horizon disaster in the Gulf of Mexico, those vital resources of income can be devastated by oil spills, as can public health and the environment, with Gulf Coast states having lost an estimated $22 billion in economic spending, having experienced environmental devastation, and whose residents experience direct and indirect effects to their health and upheaval of their ways of life as a result of the Deep Horizon oil spill. And in the case of offshore drilling, oil spills are not the exception, but the norm. According to the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, between 5,000 and 10,000 oil spills are reported annually at drilling platforms, pipelines, tankers, and coastal facilities in U.S. waters, and an average of 157,000 barrels of oil are inadvertently released from oil production each year. Given these clear dangers, I want to make clear that it is vital to join every East Coast governor and the many municipalities who have already expressed offshore drilling opposition, given that Havre de Grace would undoubtedly be impacted by the myriad and adverse effects likely resulting from offshore drilling and the seismic blasting that would be associated with that, especially considering that if conditions were right, an oil spill could potentially drift as far north as Baltimore City. And as a young person who is deeply concerned about the conclusion of the latest UN climate assessment that we have a mere 12 years to act on climate change and reduce our fossil fuel dependency, I urge everyone here to make a commitment to stand against oil drilling and seismic blasting, and to stand up for a livable and sustainable present and future. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kinney. Next under presentations, item D. I'd like to call forward Mrs. Caroline Wood.
Hi, I'm Carol Zimmerman of the Havre de Grace Green Team, president of the Havre de Grace Green Team, and I'm going to introduce our speaker. First, I'd like to thank the mayor and council for letting us speak to you tonight. We'd like to thank you for this opportunity to talk to you about an issue that is important not only to the Green Team, but to many other residents of Havre de Grace. And that is the risk that oil drilling in the Atlantic poses to the Chesapeake Bay and our community. So therefore, the Green Team, in conjunction with Harford County Climate Action, has invited Caroline Wood of the Oceana organization, an expert in this issue, to present information to you this evening. And before I turn over the podium to her, though, I'd like also to ask everyone who is here this evening in support of this issue to stand up. Thank you very much. And Caroline?
Pass that down.
Good evening, welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Hi, Mayor Martin, council members, and thanks everyone for being here. That's incredible. My name's Caroline Wood. I work for Oceana. I'm our field campaigns manager for the East Coast, and I've been with Oceana for about 6 years now. I'm based in Washington, D.C., so it's a real treat to leave the city and come out to beautiful Havre de Grace. Thank you. Our green team, the Havre de Grace Green Team, which thank you for inviting me here tonight. We do have a local Maryland staffer who couldn't be here tonight, so I can connect you with him, and I also have my business card and some information for everyone as well. But yeah, so here tonight to talk about offshore drilling, and I think that the folks who gave testimony at the beginning of the meeting, who spoke about offshore drilling, did a really fantastic job of talking about the impacts, potential impacts of both seismic airgun testing, which is used to look for oil and gas, and offshore drilling itself. So here, and thank you. So a little bit of background on the federal process. Offshore drilling is leased on a 5-year time schedule. So roughly every 5 years, there is a new 5-year drilling program, which is scheduled leases for oil and gas. I first started working on this issue, like I mentioned, about 6 years ago. Under the Obama administration, we were working on the 2017 to 2022 or 21 5-year OCS program. And in that program, in the first draft, for the first time, the Atlantic planning area, which was, at that point, it was from the border of Virginia and Maryland all the way down to the border of Georgia and Florida, was included in that draft program. As part of my work, similar to what we're doing this year, speaking with local communities, what we saw was a whole slew of coastal opposition coming from the grassroots level. And so communities started passing resolutions opposed to oil and gas drilling. They started talking to their members of Congress. And as part of this process, when President Obama eventually announced that in the second draft of that program that the Atlantic was not included, had been removed, they explicitly said that was in part due to grassroots opposition and hearing from local communities who would be impacted by offshore drilling. So fast forward to today, we are fighting this issue again. In 2017, President Trump issued an executive order to his administration ordering them to restart a new offshore drilling program and expedite seismic exploration permits. So last year in January, and I'm looking at, I hope council members can also see this screen. So I'm looking at this image here. In January of last year, this is what the first draft of the new drilling program looked like. And you can see that the entirety of the Atlantic planning areas is included in that draft. So that was met with all of the same opposition that the proposed program under the Obama administration was met with, and then some. We are right now waiting for the second draft of this drilling program to be announced. We expect that any day now. And we do expect, typically, historically, in these programs, the second draft is a whittled down version of the first draft. So we don't yet know what that draft is going to look like, but there's strong likelihood that some Atlantic area will be in that program, and it could be Atlantic area off the coast of Maryland. So I also want to talk a little bit about seismic airgun blasting, which is a separately regulated issue. Seismic airgun blasting is the way that they search for oil and gas under the seabed. And you can see in this image, ships carry or drag large arrays of air guns behind them. The air guns emit very loud pulses of sound. The sound waves need to be loud enough to travel many miles through the sea column and then into the sea floor to where the oil and gas deposits may be located, and then bounce back up. And we're able to read that data to make an educated guess about where oil and gas might be located. That's just the first step of the exploration process. Following that, oil and gas companies still need to drill exploratory wells. And many folks don't know that the BP Deepwater Horizon oil rig was an exploratory well. So before we even see any production of drilling, we have to go through the seismic airgun blasting and then exploratory drilling, which can be very risky. One of the folks who spoke earlier talked about the impacts of sound to marine life. Very obviously, marine mammals who depend on sound for feeding, mating, communicating with each other, those animals are going to see very large impacts. But we're also concerned about things like fish species, bivalves, shellfish, anything in the ocean really can be affected by this sound. It's one of the loudest man-made sounds in the ocean, and these noises from air guns can be heard from the distance between Washington, D.C. and L.A., which is a very, very long distance. So this image up here, the map, was the first map of all of the permit applications to conduct seismic airgun blasting. These are all individual companies who applied with the federal administration to do these surveys. You can see that there were many, and they are overlapping. At this point, there are 5 permit applications currently being considered. They are still overlapping, and that's because the information that they get from these surveys is proprietary. So the information is sold to oil and gas companies, and they cannot share that between each other. So when you imagine the impacts of one seismic survey at this scale, you have to imagine that not quadrupled, but 5 times. So what's at risk in Maryland broadly? We did an analysis that found that there were 96,000 jobs and $6 billion in GDP supported by ocean-based industries, so tourism, ocean recreation, and fishing. And that's just in Maryland. If you look at the entire East Coast, which is right now what they're proposing, that's on a much, much huger scale to kind of zoom out. And to zoom in, I believe that's my next slide, I wanted to talk a little bit about potential local impacts. I think that communities along the Chesapeake Bay are in a really unique position because we hear a lot about impacts to the Atlantic coast. And under the Obama administration, when we first started seeing these resolutions and seeing this opposition grow, much of it was from coastal communities. At this point, I think it's really clear that impacts are going to affect not just the Atlantic coast of Maryland, but also the Chesapeake Bay communities. And again, I'm super grateful that we had some citizens here tonight talking about some of those potential impacts. One really iconic species is the Chesapeake Bay blue crab. I did not know this until recently, but the blue crab, along with several other species that are important here in the Chesapeake Bay, are not born here in the bay. They're born at the mouth of the bay down off the coast of Virginia. The female crabs migrate out to the Atlantic to spawn, and then those juvenile crabs eventually return up the bay to live out their adult lives. So that's just one species that could be impacted by seismic airgun blasting. In addition, we're talking about any of the potential impacts from oil and gas that have already been talked about tonight. So chronic pollution from daily operations, coastal industrialization, increased shipping traffic, and as always, the looming potential for a catastrophic spill like the BP Deepwater Horizon disaster. And we know that communities down in the Gulf are still recovering from that disaster. And after that spill, it wasn't just the communities that had oil on their shores. It was communities nearby. Even the perception of oil pollution or oil on the beach or contaminated seafood was enough to deter tourism and visitors and cause economic impacts to those communities. And this is just another graphic. It's a little bit hard to see, but it shows the migration of that blue crab, and I'd be happy to pass on more information to folks if they'd like. And the next one is an overlay of the size of the BP Deepwater Horizon oil sheen, overlaid on top of our coast here at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. One thing I think that's really important and why seeing such widespread opposition to this practice is so key is that we know that oil is not going to follow state boundaries. So what happens at the mouth of the bay, what happens farther south or to the north of us is also going to have an impact on Maryland's coast. So this is a map. I think it looks like as of May 18th, it's been hard to keep up with all of the growing opposition to this practice. And I think for the most part, folks are really realize that, one, this is something that is directly threatening coastal economies, coastal communities, coastal livelihoods. Two, our voices really do matter. The number of communities that have weighed in makes a huge impact. And once this next iteration of the drilling program is released, it's going to kick off a 90-day comment period. And that is the last chance for the public to weigh in directly with the administration. It's the last chance that communities like this will have to express their opposition directly to BOEM. And so I think I think it would be a fantastic idea to take action at the local level. In Maryland, as of today, 8 municipalities have passed resolutions opposing offshore drilling and seismic airgun blasting. And I have a list here if that would be helpful. Most recently, St. Mary's County, Worcester County, and Crisfield, Maryland have passed resolutions. And I think someone mentioned earlier that opposition in Maryland is strong. It is bipartisan. I would say it's nonpartisan. Our governor, Hogan, as well as Representative Harris, and the rest of the Maryland delegation have come out in opposition to drilling off Maryland's coast. I think that's all I wanted to say. I do have some information that I can leave with folks, and I am more than happy to answer questions if you have them.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Appreciate you being here this evening. I have a couple, well, actually one question. Other than the Gulf of Mexico, is there anywhere that you know of along the United States seaboard where they allowed offshore drilling?
So there was drilling off the West Coast. So the Santa Barbara oil spill, I don't remember what year that was, but that was one of the things that fired up the environmental movement generally in the United States. But there was active drilling off the West Coast. And there are some active leases, I believe one active lease, farther north in the Alaska or Arctic planning area. But it is not my area of expertise, so I can get you that information.
And it's believed, I mean, I guess since Chesapeake Bay is tidal, that an oil spill could make it all the way up to Havre de Grace, for example.
For sure, yeah. And I think I mentioned earlier that there's always this looming threat of a catastrophic oil spill. But what we also see and what we can see in the Gulf of Mexico is day-to-day pollution, small spills that aren't reported, coastal industrialization, and those impacts aren't dependent on an oil spill. Those would be happening potentially every day and would certainly not stay at the mouth of the bay.
Yeah, we have a hard enough time here in Havre de Grace with silt coming down the river from behind the dam. Imagine putting crude oil on top of that silt.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
But no, I appreciate your answering some of my questions. Council, do you have any questions for Mrs. Wood? I'll start with Ms. Zinner and work way down.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. It's very educational. I was just wondering if there's any legal challenges at this point to the executive order, and if so, where they might stand, and also to some of the other areas that are under consideration for drilling. I know the Arctic Refuge is proposed to be opened up, and I'm just curious as to where maybe some of those legal cases might stand at this point.
Yeah, as far as I know, there have not been legal challenges to the executive order. There are current lawsuits on the issue of seismic airgun blasting, which I can speak a little bit more to if you'd like. But really, my focus is Atlantic drilling, and we're still awaiting final actions on offshore drilling specifically.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Councilmember Roberts.
Hi, Ms. Wood. First of all, thank you for coming all the way up here. I'm hoping that you're enjoying your time in Havre de Grace.
Absolutely.
I guess one concern that's been brought up has been the state representative positions. Would you happen to know, or would anyone from your group happen to know what some of the state legislatures have said, and has anyone from the group gone to the state legislators, to our representatives here in 34, and discussed this matter with them?
I have spoken, so I actually started with Oceana as our Mid-Atlantic organizer, so I did some organizing work in years past. And we did circulate and help with some sign-on letters, so there were a number of Maryland state legislators who signed on to letters when we were fighting this, the last drilling program, which I'd be happy to share. I believe that the Maryland legislature looked at some drilling-related legislation in the last general session. I don't have that specific information, but I'd be happy to share it as a follow-up.
I'd appreciate it if you
Sure.
could. And when you say the last drilling cycle, was that 2010?
This was the previous drilling program that originally, it was the first time that the entire Atlantic was included, or large swaths of the Atlantic was included, was the 2017 drilling program.
Oh, 2017.
In 2010, there was a small, a very small section of planning area off the coast of Virginia that was briefly considered. And then the BP Deepwater Horizon disaster happened, and all of it was.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah.
All right. Also, I did want to make mention, though, when you brought up the crab migrations, that reminds me that, another big industry in Maryland is our rock fishing.
Mhm.
It's a lot of folks go trophy rock fishing, or just, on the weekends, whatever. And rockfish only get that big, or only come up through the bay from the Atlantic and on their way up north and then back down. So I do want to remind folks that our rock fishing industry would be severely jeopardized, I think, if there were a spill at the mouth. That's it, Mr. Mayor.
Yeah, thank you. Anybody else, any other council members to comment? Again, Ms. Wood, thank you very much for your time to come in here, and I can't speak for the council president, he's not here this evening, but I know that there is a desire to turn this issue into some kind of legislative resolution action. That I will have to discuss with the council president, and he'll disseminate it among the council to see what course of action they want to take. Again, I can't speak for council, and the same council member wants to speak for me, but we understand what you're asking, and it'll be addressed.
Sure, absolutely. If I can help at all, please let me know, and thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. We appreciate it.